Washington Journal continues.
Congressman Michael Burgess at our table, Republican of Texas. He sits on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and he's the top Republican on the Health Subcommittee of that panel. He's also a member of the Rules Committee. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on, Greta. I appreciate it.
You've probably seen Michael Bloomberg's ads. He's blitzing the airwaves with ads about health care. I just want to show our viewers. We'll come back and talk about it.
Soaring health insurance deductibles and medical bills are fueling an affordability crisis.
What's Trump's plan? Repeal Obamacare, threatening coverage for millions of Americans. Mike Bloomberg knows the value of quality health care. A successful entrepreneur, Mike built a business with 20,000 employees, each with great health care and paid leave. As mayor of New York, Mike cut the number of uninsured people by nearly half, expanded health care for working families, and improved care for seniors.
It's time to get real and fix health care. People don't have the health care that they need, and this is America. We can certainly afford to make sure that everybody that needs to see a doctor can see a doctor.
As president, Mike will provide universal access to affordable health care, lower costs by capping health care prices, and expand access to women's health services. And Mike will make sure everyone without health care can get it, and everyone who likes theirs can keep it. How do you know Mike Bloomberg will deliver on health care? Because he's done it before.
Congressman, the president responded in a tweet saying, Mini Mike Bloomberg is spending a lot of money on false advertising. I was the person who saved pre-existing conditions in your health care. You have it now, while at the same time winning the fight to rid you of the expensive, unfair, and very unpopular individual mandate. And if Republicans win in court and take back the House of Representatives, your health care that I have now brought to the best place in many years will become the best ever by far. I will always protect your pre-existing conditions. The Dems will not. This is the Washington Times headline about the president's claims. Trump falsely claims he saved part of Obamacare.
Well, every time the president talks about health care, I mean, the first thing that he says is that he will always protect pre-existing conditions. And I believe him that he will. So what to me as a member of the legislative body, the signal the president is sending to me is that he will not sign anything we send him that does not protect pre-existing conditions.
What about the lawsuit, though, that's underway? Explain what the lawsuit is and where it is right now, because people point to that as, Democrats, I should say, point to that and say, Republicans want to do away with your health care and pre-existing conditions. They support this lawsuit.
Well, first off, it's not the president's lawsuit. It's a lawsuit brought by state attorneys general. Attorney General of my state is one of the participants. And it's to answer a very fundamental legal question. You will recall back in 2012 when the Affordable Care Act challenge went all the way to the Supreme Court, 5 justices on the Supreme Court said that the individual mandate was likely unconstitutional, but Congress had the power to tax, and because of that power to tax, the law could stay as it was. And I think Justice Roberts went a little further and said, don't look to the courts to do things that, I think he was speaking to Congress, don't look to the courts to do things that you should be doing legislatively. So the last thing I want to do is to predict what the Supreme Court will do, because I'm always wrong when I do that. But the same 5 justices that came up with this rather tortuous logic to keep the Affordable Care Act in place are still there. And it would take a leap of faith to say that they are going to reassess their position and come to a different answer. But the removal of the individual mandate, or actually the zeroing out, it's not removed, it's still there. You know what, if the Democrats wanted to moot this lawsuit, they would pass a bill that repealed the individual mandate, and you know what? Lawsuit goes away. Or they could pass a provision that says, we forgot to put a severability clause in the Affordable Care Act. We're going back and adding one retroactively. So if any part of the Affordable Care Act is found outside the bounds of the Constitution, the rest of it can stay. I don't know why they never did that in the first place. The version that passed in the House back in whatever that was, 2009, 2010, the version that passed in the House did have a severability clause. Don't know whether it was by design or just an oversight that the Senate version, which is the one that eventually became law, didn't address. They were silent on that issue. probably didn't make good sense.
This from the Washington Times. House Republicans approved a bill in 2017, Mr. Trump's first year in office, that would have allowed states to opt out of rules requiring insurers to charge people with pre-existing conditions the same price as healthy people. Mr. Trump celebrated the bill's passage with House Republicans at the White House, though the repeal and replace efforts stalled in the Senate. Is this still the goal of the House GOP?
When that bill passed out of our committee in spring of 2017, it did the principal things that we had been asked to do, which was repeal the taxes, repeal the mandates, soft landing for people on the Medicaid expansion, and to change the subsidy structure to a tax credit structure. All of those things were accomplished in the bill. After it left our committee, it changed, and relying on part of the Affordable Care Act, the part that allows for what are called 1332 waivers, state flexibility plans, that language was added to the bill. But there were additional safeguards, additional guardrails that were provided that any state that opted to do this would have to perform within certain parameters. And one of those was you had to allow a path back in for someone who'd allowed their insurance to lapse. Remember, if someone keeps continuous coverage, they're not in any trouble at all. But if they allowed their insurance to lapse, you had to find a way to allow them back in. That's what all of the discussion was. That's what all the more heat than light in the last election cycle. But that was the provision that got all the attention. The parts that came through our committee, and that was a long markup, 28, 29 hours. It was brutal. And then we did it for 18 or 19 more hours in the Rules Committee. So being on both committees, I got to do it twice. But that was pretty solid policy. The provision that added the 1332 waivers may not have been the most judicious. That's why we should do things that go through the committee process and not simply add things on the floor, which we see the other side now doing almost routinely.
We'll go to calls. Stu is up first in Arizona, independent caller.
Thank you, Greta. Mr. Burgess, on or about January 8th, 2017, Donald Trump said that he and his transition team were putting the final touches on a health care bill that would give us far better care at a fraction of the price. And he said he'd be rolling it out the first of the next week, which was only I think this was on a Thursday he made that speech. Have you or anyone seen the document that he produced?
Well, I think there's been ample evidence of the types of policies that he wanted to pursue, and that has been done through a series of executive orders that the president has put forward: association health plans, health reimbursement accounts, the transparency executive order that he did a few weeks ago that allowed for the expansion of health savings accounts. So the president has been pretty straight up about putting these policies out there. It is our job on the legislative side, of course, to legislate. We shouldn't just do things by executive orders, because as we've seen in the past, what happens as an executive order may not endure into the next administration. So if in order for it to be durable, we should pass it legislatively. But I think the president has laid out a good ground game.
Logan, Utah. Bob, a Democratic caller.
Yes, good morning. I'd just like to say the two ads that you had on, you hit the nail right on the head. This president does nothing but lie to people. And how the Republican Party can stand up for him without confronting him, Anyways, the man's been impeached, and he'll go down in history as a Lion King. I guess that's all I have to say.
Do you have a response, Congressman?
Well, I think the United States House of Representatives was not at its finest when that impeachment vote was taken last month. But more to the point, President Trump took office in January 2017. Since the president took office, and the latest figures actually from last March from the Congressional Budget Office, 2.5 million more people have employer-sponsored insurance than when the president took the oath of office. That's a pretty rapid expansion of that segment of the insurance market. You couple that with something like association health plans and health reimbursement accounts, and suddenly you're getting up to numbers of people who have either have access or in fact have insurance that is unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. Without a government mandate, without a government, without punishing people, which is what the Affordable Care Act did. The entire fuel that fueled the Affordable Care Act was taxes and mandates.
What's the linkage between the rise in employer insurance?
Well, certainly the economy, which has done so well since the president took office. And I know people say, well, it was already the building blocks were already in place. But if you look at that trajectory of what has happened with the economy since the president came into office, really there's an inflection point, and it happens about the end of January of 2017. This president has overseen one of the largest expansions of the economy that certainly I've seen in my lifetime. And, you know, the old Jack Kemp phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. So indeed, some of those boats were filled with people who needed insurance and got it as a consequence of their employment. And further, I would say this, the people who get employer-sponsored insurance, you know what, that wasn't part of the Affordable Care Act. That was a compromise between Speaker Gingrich and then President Clinton back in 1996. In order to get the ability for large corporations to sell insurance in multiple states, they had to come under a group of regulations called the ERISA regulations. And what is one of the principal ERISA regulations? Well, it's to allow the coverage for pre-existing conditions without underwriting, without an exclusionary period. And that already exists in the large group market. That's why I'm so excited about things like association health plans, because it would give small and medium-sized businesses like my business would give us the ability to participate in the large group market, which would be lower cost and better protection for our employees.
Audrey in Alabama, Independent, you're next for the congressman.
Good morning, Greta and Congressman Burgess. I have had a struggle here lately. I'm 100% permanent and total disabled veteran, and which entitles my son to what's called CHAMP VA. Mm-hmm. And in October when he turned 18, keep in mind he's still a high school senior, I had to put in paperwork. CHAMP VA was 4 months behind. He had a little break in insurance. They've extended his coverage till May of 2020. Now, if he doesn't go to college, he is not entitled to CHAMP VA anymore. I think you've let our group slip through the cracks because you let middle-class families that have a job and get it through their employer stay till the age of 26. But my son is an exception to that, and we've checked with the college and everything, and he's going to have a lapse from like May till fall semester where he's not going to have any insurance. And Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama, they're a monopoly, and that's the only choice we have. I've called. It's $8,600 a year with a $5,000 deductible for the best plan they carry. So if you could look into this and maybe you could do something, you know, a little fix for this. Yeah. I don't know if you've handed authorization to VA.
Okay, Audrey,
you know,
I'll have the congressman respond.
But specifically, Audrey, that is a valid point that you brought up, because, of course, everyone believed that insurance was going to be available to age 26 for kids. They could stay on their parents' plan. If that's an oversight in the writing of the Affordable Care Act, surely that's one of those things that needs to be addressed. But let me just say this specifically. If you have not talked to your representative where you live in Alabama, or one of your senators, one of your United States senators in Alabama, worthwhile to do so. They can do a constituent inquiry on your behalf and look into the particulars of your case. As far as the larger policy goes, yeah, you better believe I'll be talking to our top Republican on the Veterans Affairs Committee about that very issue.
Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Dennis, Democratic caller.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call.
Good morning.
I'd like to comment that Mr. Burgess belongs to a party that has opposed Social Security, opposed Medicare, opposed Medicaid, opposed workman's compensation, and the number of people without health insurance has increased. He also is from a state that has failed to expand Medicaid. 1 in 4 people in Texas have no insurance. And this is a party that we expect is going to have great health care. Pigs will fly before that happens. So have a nice day, and thank you.
Thank you. Let's just unpack a couple of those things. As far as the expansion of Medicaid, no, that was part of that Supreme Court decision back in 2012. Obviously, under the language of the Affordable Care Act, then President Obama said every state has to. The Supreme Court said that's probably coercive, and the states cannot be required to expand Medicaid if they don't wish to. Governor Perry at the time was concerned that the federal government wasn't always a reliable partner, and the difficulty is once you expand Medicaid, you cannot walk that back. There is another federal regulation provision called the maintenance of effort, that once you begin something, you don't have the option to then just walk away from it. So there was significant concern on the part of the governor and the state legislature. I'm sure it's something they look at every legislative session. What we do have in Texas is under some things like the what's called the 1115 waiver that allows for additional funding to come to hospitals that take care of an outsized number of uninsured and underinsured patients. And let's not forget, it's the Affordable Care Act that also reduces those disproportionate share payments that go to hospitals that take care of underinsured and uninsured patients. So there's some downsides that are waiting for hospitals in the Affordable Care Act. And in fact, we just gave the hospitals a little bit of a reprieve in the last budget bill, but we have not fixed that problem. It will continue. As far as Republicans not being, obviously I was not around when the Social Security laws were passed back in the 1930s or whatever it was. I certainly wasn't in Congress when Medicare passed, but if I recall correctly, from the middle 1960s when I was just a child, President Johnson passed Medicare because he had Republican votes. He did not have the votes strictly just on the Democratic side, particularly in the Senate. He relied on Republican votes to get the Medicare law passed. So that argument actually is one people make, but I don't know if it's entirely accurate.
We'll go to New Orleans. Joe is watching there on our line for Democrats.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Joe.
First, I want to make an announcement. Last night on PBS, I saw a documentary called From Obama to Trump. It's in 2 parts. I urge everyone to find that particular show and look at it. And it explains how we are in the predicament that we are now as a nation. Then I would like to say the Republican Party was against the Affordable Care Act from the very beginning. Your party offered no assistance in writing that bill. I can remember that the president wanted Republicans and Democrats to work on a committee, which they did. Then the Republicans pulled out and started talking about death panels. They were negative. So no, you all don't have a plan to better health care because you are interested in destroying the whole concept, and mainly because it was done under President Obama.
Okay, and Congressman, you were shaking your head while she was talking.
Realistically, yes. President Obama repeatedly said things like, I welcome anyone to come down to the White House and we'll go through this law line by line. I promise you, I faxed an immediate missive off to the president, said I'll be glad to come down. What time would you like me to be there? And I never got a response until several weeks later when I was told that Congressman Burgess would not be invited to the White House to go through the law line by line. There was a lot of disingenuous statements made on both sides when the Affordable Care Act was coming through, but when you talk about, I did not see the PBS piece last night, so that's interesting. Here's a government-funded television project that has produced something. But the talk was that how we got to the disaster that is this administration, I have to disagree, because what's been the economic picture? How has it changed between President Obama and President Trump? Well, it's gotten substantially better. What has happened with the employment situation between President Obama and President Trump? It's gotten substantially better. Consumer confidence is at an all-time high, and I do understand why people aren't aware or talking about things like this, because what was the figure I saw on one of the other channels this morning? News coverage of impeachment has been over 14.5 hours. The economy has been 9 minutes over the past year. So yeah, I understand why people are led to believe that everything is chaotic and in disarray. But again, I go back to the other Jack Kemp statement, a rising tide lifts all boats. People are doing better today under the presidency of Donald Trump than they have really at any time since I've been in the House of Representatives.
On controlling drug prices, the Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, Republican, chairs the Senate Finance Committee. According to the Hill newspaper, said this: I made it very clear, just strictly from a political standpoint, that every one of these senators is hearing the same thing I am in Iowa. People are fed up with big increases in drug prices, and there's 22 Republicans up for re-election, and they need an answer to that. Has the president done enough?
Well, the president's done a lot, but in fact more than the legislative branch. The president, again, put forward in a couple of executive orders the rebate rule, which would have moved the rebates, which right now are going to middlemen and insurance companies, and move those back in the direction of the patient. That's a provision that I support. In fact, an amendment I tried to get accepted in committee when Speaker Pelosi's prescription drug bill was marked up. Yeah, I think that's a solid proposition, and one that really legislatively we do need to take a look at. The president also did something that was a little controversial with the International Price Index. Yeah, as Republicans, we believe in markets, but if pharmaceuticals are indeed sold in a global market, is it reasonable for us to be paying more than everyone else in that market? And the International Price Index rule actually tried to rein that in a little bit. Now,
is it working?
Well, that didn't actually make it through the final cut, so it never got through the agency. But one of the things in the HR 19, the prescription drug bill House Republicans passed, which I wish Senator Grassley would take a look at, because it would answer a lot of his problems that he has for those 22 Republican senators that are up for re-election. One of the provisions in that was to engage the United States Trade Representative. And why is it that intellectual property that's developed in the United States is not protected, and it is allowed to be siphoned off by other countries and then sold for a pittance, and that American patients are expected to foot the entire bill for research and development? That doesn't sound right. But that was one of the provisions in HR 19. And again, I would encourage Senator Grassley to take a look at what we did on the House side with HR 19. Senator Grassley has some interesting ideas in the bill that he's proposed for his senators. There are a couple of things that are a bridge too far, but probably 90% of what Senator Grassley has proposed was actually in the bill that House Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce Committee used as an amendment in the nature of a substitute when we debated Speaker Pelosi's bill.
We'll go to John, Red Wing, Minnesota, Democratic caller.
Hi, yes. I'd like to know if you are successful in stopping this mandatory insurance. Will that also cover non-custodial parents who are ordered by the court to maintain their medical insurance, to get the medical insurance from their employer if it's available, and if it is not available, they are required to pay for medical assistance, the Medicaid? Now, are you going to declare all of us citizens of the United States covered by the Constitution?
Well, all citizens of the United States are covered by the Constitution. To answer the last part First, the custodial arrangements are generally set forth in whatever the court papers are that are responsible for the dissolution of the marriage and the divorce requirements. Look, there are plenty of places where is room for improvement. He didn't state specifically what his problem was. I'd encourage him once again, his representative to either to the House or is one of his state senator or one of his United States senators can do a constituent inquiry on his behalf. We do that sort of stuff all the time in my office. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we aren't. But in a complicated case, rather than try to legislate to every complicated case, sometimes there's an answer through the agency that your member of Congress or your senator can help you with.
All right, Kim, in Iowa, independent.
I have a question, two questions. First of all, Mr. Burgess, I would like to know, do you believe everything that Trump says? Second question, I wanted to know, why is our Department of Justice, is it the Supreme Court trying to get them to rule against Obamacare? If you guys, Republicans, believe in everyone should be covered for health care, not asset, covered.
Okay, Kim. Kim, I'm going to have the congressman respond. We're running out of time.
To answer the first part of your question first, I don't believe everything that anyone says other than my wife. So that's a given. Remember, it is not the president who is bringing this lawsuit. It is the state attorneys general, which is their right to do. When the ruling came down from the Supreme Court, it said because the individual mandate is a tax, that's why the Affordable Care Act can stay in place. And they've asked a legitimate legal question. There is no longer, the tax has been zeroed out. So absent the tax, is this law still constitutional? Again, I've told you my perspective is the same 5 justices that found a way to continue the Affordable Care Act are still on the court. And again, I don't want to speak for them, but I think it'd be a pretty difficult thing to decide that, hey, I was wrong in 2012, and now I want to rule in a different way. But still, it's a legitimate question to be answered. The president has, the only activity on the president's part was they said we're not going to put the Department of Justice in the middle of this. So it is being litigated in the courts. And look, I referenced the President's Association Health Plan rule a little while ago. That actually got blocked by court action from attorneys general in Massachusetts and New York, I believe. And in fact, there was no stay put on that. So while that goes through the appeals process, companies that had already begun to explore things like association health plans for their employees are now sort of left in limbo. And all that investment that they've made is they're not sure what's going to happen to it. It would have been a reasonable thing for the judge in that case to put a stay on implementing that order, just as the judge did in the Affordable Care Act case. Nothing is different today than it was a year ago. The other thing that I think really needs to be looked at, when we all fall victim of looking at just right now, but if you look over the last 10 years since the Affordable Care Act, and we are coming up to the 10-year anniversary, when you look at the last 10 years, what has happened to insurance premiums? Are they lower, as was promised when President Obama first proposed the Affordable Care Act? No, they are not. They're substantially higher. One of the callers referenced the very high premium that they would pay, and I suspect that's for a bronze plan in the Blue Cross system. I know that because when the Affordable Care Act passed and Speaker Boehner and Leader Reid and President Obama all got together and decided, ooh, we better do a special deal for members of Congress, otherwise everyone's going to retire if they're forced onto this Affordable Care Act insurance, and they did. So members of Congress have the ability to get a tax-free subsidy that they can then walk into the DC exchange. I didn't do that. I thought that was wrong. I thought it would be challenged in the court and be found to be illegal. Again, once again, I was wrong about projecting what's going to happen in the courts. But so I very much understand, because that I did what every other constituent in my district who's in the individual market, I did what they had to do. I got on the phone for hours at a time to work with healthcare.gov. If you recall, at the time, it was not working very well. And I finally was able to get coverage with a bronze plan. I'm like anybody else, I buy on price. but I had a premium that was higher than anything I'd ever seen before, $700 a month just for an individual, and had a $6,800 deductible. Well, I've had a health savings account for a while, so I'm used to high deductibles, but nothing of that magnitude. And that's why you hear the complaints now about the complexity and the cost of healthcare, is because individuals are bearing a far greater burden of those healthcare expenses than they ever were before the imposition of the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act was, if you will, it was a transfer payment and transferring from one group of citizens to another. There's no question that some people, we've heard this morning, some people benefited from the Affordable Care Act, but I promise you, the people I hear from in my district say, we don't qualify for a subsidy. A policeman and a teacher in my district will be outside that subsidy range with what they earn, so good for them. But since they don't qualify for a subsidy, every time that silver benchmark plan increases in price, their premium goes up. Now, someone who's subsidized said, I don't care, I got a subsidy, and the subsidy went up along with the premium because it's benchmarked to the silver plan. But that couple who's paying the retail price for the Affordable Care Act, their premium just went up, and it went up a lot. And guess what? Their deductible did not come down.
Congressman, we always appreciate the conversation with you. Thank you,
Sure.
and come back again.
Glad to do it. I'll bring my copy of the Affordable Care Act next time. I apologize for leaving that back in the office.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to turn our attention to Senator Sanders and Senator Warren's feud over gender. Can a woman be elected president? There are the phone numbers on your screen. Then later, we'll be joined by Democratic Congresswomen